Hey, it's Dr. Parker. I'm going to do what I think will be a fairly short screencast introducing The Knight's Tale, partly because I don't really have terribly much to say about it, believe it or not. I'll have probably a lot to say after you read it. And also, you may can hear I've got a little bit of a cold and I need to preserve my voice as best as can. I'm sure there are a lot of people pulling for it to go out altogether, but no such luck. The Knight's Tale, which is a fairly difficult thing to read, but I think since you all have read the Dream Visions, you'll probably be pretty well prepared for what's coming. It does have a source, Boccaccio's Teseida, which dates from about 1340, which is about the year Chaucer was born, and it is something that Chaucer would have read probably in his travels on the continent. It's a good deal longer in Boccaccio's version, believe it or not, even though it's pretty long in Chaucer's. But there's also a change in, I don't know, mood and theme. The one in Boccaccio's much more of a, would be considered to be an epic. It's much longer. Also, the character of Emily in Boccaccio is a little bit more able to act and to decide on her own destiny, which is really the opposite of what happens in Chaucer's version, where the hallmark is that Emily's feelings and wants and needs are scarcely under consideration at all. Here we have a nice painting, and I'm sorry I didn't get the whole thing in there because there is a portrait of Emily, but this is based on Boccaccio's version and not Chaucer's, but there are the two cousins in there looking upon Emily. Um, just kind of a fun FYI kind of fact, this story was taken by Shakespeare, at least partly by Shakespeare. There's a play called The Two Noble Kinsmen, which is written around 1613, which is we're pretty sure at least is partly by Shakespeare, if not mostly by Shakespeare, although it's not always considered in his regular canon. So yeah, if you ever run across The Two Noble Kinsmen, it's based upon this story as well. Um, Temples, yes. So we have you have your basic story, the two cousins who see the fair lady from afar and they fall in love with her, and they fight over who gets her, who saw her first, and things like that. And the lady is blissfully unaware of this until years and years later when they are fighting each other, and the lady and her sister and brother-in-law happen upon them in the woods. So they prepare for this epic battle where they're going to contest for the lady's hand, and each of the main characters, including the lady, goes and worships at a temple the night before. And this is probably as important as anything in the poem. This section with the temples. We have the one Palamon, the first knight, who goes to the temple of Venus, and in this painting you can see him on the right. Um, Although that temple looks a little bit more like Diana because we see it's an archer, and I wonder if the painter got confused because in the middle you see Emily and she's worshiping, supposed to be at the temple of Diana, who's the goddess of chastity, um, and this is Lucina, the queen of the moon, who is a let's see, a version of Diana. Diana appeared in different ways, but one of them was as the Queen of the Moon and was the goddess of childbirth, which is kind of an interesting paradox because she was the goddess of chastity, but also the goddess of childbirth. But I think all of things that relate to women's sexuality, because as the goddess of the moon, she was the goddess of the monthly cycle. So Emily's praying to her, and then finally on the far left you see Arcita, who is praying to Mars, the god of war, and it is that's one of the most chilling and kind of spectacular depictions in Chaucer is the Temple of Mars with his horror movie type scenes in it, people having all sorts of death and destruction. And then even later in the poem, when we hear about the god Saturn, he's even the patron god of more cruel and spectacularly violent things than Mars is. Um, but I thought you probably thought you were done with temples when we got past the dream visions, especially temples of Venus, but no such luck. So I think each of the gods or goddesses represents the personality of the one who prays to them. So certainly pay attention to those passages. Another thing that you're going to be introduced to in the Knight's Tale, and it will probably be the last time in your life you'll ever deal with it, but is the philosophy of Boethius. Boethius was a Roman, late Roman philosopher, was a Christian martyr, um, who wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which Chaucer translated from Latin into English. You can read his Boece if you want to, which is his translation of Boethius. Um, but Chaucer put some elements of Boethian philosophy into this poem, especially at the end. The Duke Theseus has some speeches where he I guess he sort of summarizes Boethius, although some people have argued that he does a pretty poor job of it. But Boethius deals with a couple of things, one of which is the idea that God is the first mover, this sort of proof of the existence of God, that everything is a reaction to a cause, therefore there must be a first cause, therefore we can call that first cause God. And that was one of Boethius's arguments. But the one that the poem's more concerned with is the idea of providence and chance and the ways in which they serve God. And it gets into this idea of free will. Chaucer is really one of the first people in English, I guess, to address the idea of free will, but people have been arguing about it, of course, for years and years. If God is God and he knows everything and he can do everything, does it not follow that he causes everything, that your future is predestined? Because how could there be an outcome that God doesn't already know? And Boethius kind of wrestles with this and comes up with a metaphor um, of the horse race, which is just because God knows which horse is going to win the race does not necessarily mean that he caused that horse to win the race. And that in some way this logic can be applied to everything that happens in the universe. So anyway, this is when the knights, Palamon and Arcita, will fight about who has it worse. The one that is still locked up in the tower says he has it worse because he has no hope of escaping and finding Emily. But the one who is set free thinks that he's got it worse because he's been exiled. And so even though he'll be a free man, he'll be under pain of death if he comes back in the country to seek Emily. And you, as the reader, are asked to decide which of them you think has it worse off. But this idea that God in his providence has provided for everyone, and that if you sit around and assume that you've got the worst deal, it's only because you don't understand or see the plan of God as it's going to be unfolded, because God makes all things to work for the best, even if we only see one part of that machine at a time. He sees the whole working of it. So anyway, so Boethius, Chaucer is a big fan of Boethius, and I think you could say most of his personal philosophy comes through Boethius, and so he presents it in little bits and pieces here in the Knight's Tale. So to sum up, what are some of the themes? The first, this demand to more. We talked about this before in one of the dream visions in the Parliament of Fowls, where you were asked to decide which falcon you think deserves the hand of the tercelet. Here, the question that's being asked of you is which knight has it worse? First of all, when one is exiled and the other is left in prison, and then later, I think you're asked to sort of decide which knight deserves the lady. And what's interesting, of course, is that at no point is the lady ever considered in this transaction. Who does she want to be with? Whom does she want to be with, if anyone? And the answer is she doesn't. She prays to the goddess Diana that she be allowed to live her life in chastity, but that's not considered. Another theme, a big theme, is this theme of providence. How does God provide? And when things seem to be against you, contrary to you, how do you interpret that? How does a mature spiritual person interpret it? Do you interpret it as God is against you, or rather do you take the leap of faith that this is part of a bigger and better plan that you're just not capable of seeing? And as I said earlier, some little bits and pieces of Boethian philosophy get worked in there. But finally, I think the thing to remember about this one, when you read it and it's kind of a tragic story, um, is that Chaucer is presenting this tale first of all the Canterbury Tales, and he's presenting it through the mouth of the knight, who we've talked about is clearly a pretty idealized character. Um, but I think that one of the things that we're seeing here is that if you approach your life, if you approach a worldview um, that's a pagan one, this trapped in these sort of traditional classical ideas of multiple gods and goddesses who are, very often petty or jealous or bickering among themselves and unsympathetic to you, um, there is no way for the story not to end in tragedy. There's no happy ending in a pagan universe, at least in the way that this story goes. You can act honorably insofar as you're able, but even acting honorably is not going to be sufficient to bring about sort of a happy ending. So a lot of people have posited that since Chaucer starts the Canterbury Tales here, he's sort of presenting one worldview, which is this is noble and admirable, but insufficient. It's not enough to bring about spiritual or earthly happiness. Whereas he ends with the Parson's Tale, which is a sermon which depicts a very Christian worldview, needless to say, and that maybe that is the way to sort of contentment and happiness both in this world and the next one, that you can't find it with the knight's tales ethos, but you can find it um, in sort of a more Christian worldview. And of course, he's not trying to imply that the knight is a pagan, because we know the knight to be presumably holy since he has gone and fought in crusades. But the story that he tells involves characters that are pagan. So I think that that's a theme of it too. I will try to get some questions out to you pretty quickly. This is a demanding selection, and it may be it's the hardest thing you'll read between now and the end of the semester. I think some of the House of Fame I think was a difficult read, and probably the Book of the Duchess simply because it was the first thing you read and you weren't used to Chaucer yet. But this is a good story and a tragic one, but it's reasonably long. And there's a lot going on in it. So I wish you luck with it. I'll get you out some questions. I also will try to come up with a midterm prompt for you to write something on, and I'll try to come up with that sometime in the next week, probably sooner rather than later, and I'll give you instructions on that when it is appropriate. So I hope you had a good weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.